Some wounds never heal, no matter how many winters pass or how far you run from the people who caused them. For 30 years, Jebediah Calloway has lived alone in the Montana wilderness with only his dog Briscoe, carrying the weight of his brother's betrayal like a stone in his chest. Jed thought he knew the whole story. His brother died in a shootout 3 decades ago, but not before selling him out to the men who wanted him dead. That betrayal drove Jed into the mountains, where he's lived off the land ever since, trusting no one except his loyal companion. But when Briscoe starts digging frantically at the ice of a frozen lake, he uncovers a rusted box that changes everything. Inside, Jed finds proof that his brother lived far longer than anyone knew. The evidence suggests the betrayal ran deeper than Jed ever imagined, and now he must face a terrible choice between revenge and forgiveness. What really happened that night 30 years ago, and will the truth finally set Jed free? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air cut through Jed's lungs like shattered glass as he stepped out of the cabin, his breath forming thick clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter wind. Briscoe bounded ahead, his thick coat already dusted with fresh snow that had fallen during the night. The dog's energy never ceased to amaze Jed. Even after 8 years together, the mutt still greeted each dawn like it held the promise of adventure. Their cabin sat nestled in a grove of towering pines, 20 miles from the nearest settlement, and 40 from anything resembling civilization. Jed had built it himself, log by log, during his 3rd winter in these mountains. The structure was solid, practical and sparse, just like the life he'd constructed around it. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless fires. A simple wooden table served for meals and the occasional cleaning of his hunting rifle. His bed occupied the far corner, covered with layers of fur and wool that had kept him warm through 30 brutal winters. But it was the worn leather journal on the mantelpiece that truly told the story of Jebediah Calloway's transformation. Its pages chronicled 3 decades of gradual change, from the desperate scrawling of a man running from his past to the measured observations of someone who had learned to read the mountain's moods like scripture. Early entries spoke of sleepless nights haunted by gunfire and the sound of his brother Samuel's voice calling his name. Later pages documented trap locations, weather patterns, and the slow healing that comes from living by nature's rhythms rather than man's promises. Jed pulled his coat tighter and followed Briscoe toward the lake. The dog had developed a peculiar fascination with the frozen water over the past few days, whining and pawing at the ice in a way that seemed almost desperate. It wasn't like him. Briscoe was typically focused and purposeful, traits that had kept them both alive in country where a moment's inattention could mean death. The lake stretched before them, its surface a mirror of white that reflected the grey sky above. This was Widow's Lake, though Jed doubted anyone remembered why it carried that name. He'd avoided it for most of his years in the mountains, some instinct warning him away. But age had a way of making a man confront the places he'd rather forget. And lately he'd found himself drawn here despite the unease it stirred in his chest. Briscoe bounded onto the ice, his claws scratching for purchase as he made his way toward the center. Jed followed more cautiously, testing each step. The lake was deep, deeper than most in these parts, and the ice, while thick, demanded respect. He'd seen men disappear through seemingly solid surfaces, swallowed by water so cold it stopped the heart before drowning could finish the job. As he walked, memories surfaced unbidden. Samuel had always been the reckless one, quick with a smile, and quicker with his gun. Where Jed planned and calculated, Samuel acted on instinct and charm. It had served him well in the boom towns and mining camps, but it had also made him enemies, dangerous enemies who valued gold more than blood. Jed, night that changed everything, remained burned in Jed's memory with painful clarity. They'd been partners then, working claims in the hills outside Virginia City. Samuel had gotten involved with some unsavory characters, men who promised easy money in exchange for information about successful miners. Jed had tried to warn his brother, but Samuel laughed off his concerns with that careless grin that had gotten him out of trouble since childhood. When the shooting started, Jed had been in the supply shed behind their cabin. He'd heard Samuel's voice, raised in argument, followed by the thunder of gunfire. By the time he reached the main room, his brother lay motionless in a pool of blood, while 3 men rifled through their belongings. One of them, a thin man with dead eyes, looked up from searching Samuel's pockets and smiled. "Your brother sold you out, Calloway," he'd said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man comfortable with violence. "Told us all about your claim locations, your schedules, even where you kept your dust. Smart boy, your Samuel. Shame he got greedy." Jed had killed 2 of them before the 3rd man's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him against the wall. Through the haze of pain and rage, he'd heard the survivors discussing whether to finish him or let him suffer. In the end, they'd chosen to leave him alive, perhaps thinking a wounded man would die slowly in the mountains, or maybe just enjoying the cruelty of letting him live with his brother's betrayal. He'd buried Samuel the next morning, digging through frozen ground, while his wounded shoulder screamed in protest. Then he'd packed what little remained and headed into the high country, vowing never to trust another human being as long as he drew breath. Briscoe's sharp bark brought him back to the present. The dog stood 20 feet away, pawing frantically at a section of ice that looked no different from the rest. His whining had taken on an urgent quality that Jed had learned to respect. In their years together, Briscoe's instincts had saved them from avalanches, warned them of approaching storms, and once, memorably, alerted him to a mountain lion stalking their camp. "What is it, boy?" Jed called, making his way over to where the dog worked at the ice. Briscoe's claws had managed to scrape away the top layer of snow and frost, revealing something dark beneath the frozen surface. Jed knelt beside him, brushing away more debris with his gloved hands. The outline gradually became clearer, rectangular, metallic, trapped in ice that must have been several feet thick. A strong box. Jed's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen similar containers in mining camps and banks, built to withstand fire and theft. This one was clearly old, its iron surface pitted with rust and age. What was it doing at the bottom of Widow's Lake? He spent the next hour chipping away at the ice with his hunting knife, working carefully to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath. Briscoe watched intently, occasionally offering encouragement with soft whines, or the occasional lick to Jed's face when he paused to rest his aching joints. The sun had climbed higher by the time he managed to free the strongbox from its frozen prison. It was heavier than he'd expected, and waterlogged despite its iron construction. A simple padlock secured the latch, but 3 decades of ice and rust had weakened the metal considerably. A sharp blow from the butt of his knife was enough to break it free. Jed's hands trembled as he lifted the lid, though whether from cold or anticipation, he couldn't say. The interior was lined with oiled leather that had protected its contents from the worst of the moisture. Papers, wrapped in what looked like a piece of canvas. A small cloth bag that clinked with the sound of coins. And something else, something that made his heart stop. A daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. With shaking fingers, he lifted the photograph from the box. The image was damaged by water and age, the silver surface clouded and spotted. But the faces were still clear enough to recognize. And what he saw there shattered 30 years of carefully constructed understanding. Samuel, alive, standing with 3 men in front of what looked like a mining operation. But this wasn't the wild-eyed desperado of Jed's memories. This Samuel looked older, more weathered, wearing the kind of quality clothes that spoke of prosperity. More disturbing still was the date scratched into the frame's corner, a full 5 years after the night Jed had buried his brother's body. The world seemed to tilt around him as the implications crashed through his mind like an avalanche. If Samuel had lived. If he'd somehow survived that night, then everything Jed believed about his brother's betrayal, everything he'd built his exile on, might be wrong. But if that was the case, whose body had he buried? And why had Samuel let him believe he was dead? Briscoe pressed against his side, sensing his distress. The dog's warm presence was the only thing keeping Jed anchored, as questions multiplied in his mind. Had Samuel been protecting him by faking his death? Or had the betrayal been even more calculated than he'd imagined? The other papers in the box might hold answers, but Jed's hands were shaking too badly to examine them properly. The cold was seeping through his clothes, and he realized he'd been kneeling on the ice for the better part of the morning. His knees creaked in protest as he stood. The strong box clutched against his chest like a shield. Back in the cabin, with a fire crackling in the hearth and hot coffee warming his hands, Jed finally felt steady enough to examine his discovery more thoroughly. The cloth bag contained gold coins, enough to keep a man comfortable for years. The papers included what looked like mining claims, correspondence with various business partners, and a letter addressed to someone named Marcus Webb in Denver. But it was a final item, wrapped separately in oiled silk, that hit him like a physical blow. A letter written in Samuel's familiar hand, dated just 3 years ago. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink was still clear. Jed, if you're reading this, then you found what I hoped you never would. I know you think I'm dead, and maybe that's for the best. The truth is more complicated than either of us imagined that night. I can't explain everything in a letter, but know this: I never betrayed you. Everything I did was to keep you alive. The men who wanted you dead still want you dead, and they have long memories. Stay in the mountains, brother. Stay safe. And if you can find it in your heart, forgive me for letting you believe the worst. I thought it was the only way. Samuel. Jed read the letter 3 times before setting it aside. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and Briscoe slept peacefully by the fire. But inside Jed's chest, 30 years of carefully maintained certainties were crumbling like ice in spring thaw. His brother was alive. Had been alive anyway, as recently as 3 years ago. And if Samuel was telling the truth, then everything Jed thought he knew about that terrible night was wrong. The betrayal, the blood, the desperate flight into the mountains, all of it built on a foundation of lies and misunderstanding. But why? Why let him suffer alone all these years? Why allow him to carry the weight of that betrayal like a stone in his chest? And most importantly, where was Samuel now? The questions burned in his mind as darkness fell over the mountains. Tomorrow, he would have to decide what to do with this knowledge. For 30 years, he'd lived by a simple code: trust no one, survive each day, and never look back. But the contents of that strongbox had shattered his certainty about the past, and without that anchor, he felt adrift in ways he hadn't experienced since those first desperate months of exile. Briscoe stirred in his sleep, paws twitching as he chased some dream quarry through imagined forests. The dog had led him to the truth, whether by instinct or divine providence. Now it was up to Jed to decide what to do with it. Outside, the wind carried the promise of more snow, but inside the cabin, surrounded by the evidence of his brother's survival, Jebediah Calloway began to consider the possibility that his long exile might finally be coming to an end. Dawn came too soon and brought no peace with it. Jed had spent the night staring at the cabin's rough-hewn ceiling, Samuel's letter clutched in his weathered hands. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his brother's face. Not the lifeless mask he'd buried 30 years ago, but the living, breathing man captured in that water-damaged daguerreotype. Briscoe sensed his restlessness, padding over to rest his grizzled muzzle on Jed's chest. The dog's brown eyes held an intelligence that had always unnerved visitors in the old days, back when Jed still received the occasional trapper or prospector. Now those eyes seemed to ask the question that had tormented Jed through the long hours. "What are you going to do?" He rose stiffly, his joints protesting the cold that had seeped through the cabin walls despite the banked fire. The faded daguerreotype sat on the wooden table where he'd left it, Samuel's image staring back at him across the decades. In the harsh morning light, Jed could make out details he'd missed the day before. His brother wore a fine wool coat, the kind, successful merchants favored. His hair was graying at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of years lived in comfort, rather than the desperate flight of a man marked for death. Most disturbing was Samuel's expression. There was no fear there, no haunted look of a man hiding from enemies. Instead, he appeared confident, even prosperous. The other men in the photograph seemed to defer to him, their body language suggesting he was the leader rather than a hunted fugitive. Jed picked up the photograph with trembling fingers, bringing it closer to the window where the morning sun could illuminate every detail. The background showed a well-established mining operation, not the rough camps he and Samuel had worked, but something permanent and profitable. Buildings with glass windows, neat rows of equipment, men in clean clothes supervising the work. On the back of the frame, someone had scratched additional words he'd missed in his initial shock. Clearwater Mine, Colorado Territory, 1878. 5 years after the night Jed thought his brother had died. 5 years of prosperity while Jed scraped out a living in the wilderness, haunted by guilt and betrayal. The other papers from the strongbox told a similar story. Mining claims registered under Samuel's name, correspondence with bankers and investors, receipts for equipment and supplies. His brother hadn't just survived, he'd thrived, built an empire by all accounts, while letting Jed believe he was dead. "I never betrayed you," Samuel's letter claimed. "Everything I did was to keep you alive." But if that were true, why hide? Why allow his brother to suffer alone in the mountains while he built a fortune? The questions multiplied like winter storms, each one bringing fresh anguish. Briscoe whined softly, pressing against Jed's leg. The dog could sense his distress, the way his breathing had grown shallow and his hands shook with more than cold. 30 years of careful emotional control were cracking like ice in spring thaw. Jed set the photograph aside and reached for his leather journal, the one that had chronicled his transformation from civilized man to mountain hermit. His own handwriting stared back at him from pages yellowed with age and smoke. The early entries were barely legible, scratched out in fury and despair. "Samuel is dead, shot down like a dog by the men he trusted. He sold me out for gold, and now I'm alone. Trust. No one. The mountains don't lie." Later entries showed his gradual acceptance of isolation. "Found bear tracks near the upper creek. Briscoe spotted them first. The dog has better instincts than most men I've known. Maybe that's enough." And finally, the resigned peace of recent years. Winter coming early, laid in supplies. Briscoe's getting grey around the muzzle, but he's still spry. "We've built something here, just the two of us. It's not much, but it's honest." Honest. The word mocked him now. How could any of it be honest when it was built on lies? He closed the journal and reached for the mining correspondence. The papers told a story of steady expansion, claims purchased, equipment acquired, workers hired. Samuel had used their shared knowledge of geology and ore deposits to build something substantial. The letters referenced a partner named Marcus Webb, the same name from the Denver correspondence, and spoke of plans for further expansion into Montana territory. Montana. Samuel had been moving closer, perhaps had been for years. The realization sent ice through Jed's veins. Had his brother been watching him, tracking his movements through the wilderness? One letter in particular caught his attention. Dated 18 months ago, it was addressed to J. Calloway, General. Delivery, Billings. Samuel had been trying to make contact, or at least considering it. The letter was never sent, probably never finished based on the abrupt ending, but the first lines were clear enough. "Brother, I know you must hate me for what you think I did. The truth is more complicated and more dangerous than you can imagine. The men who wanted you dead in 73 are still alive, still looking. I've kept you safe by staying away, but time is running out. There are things you need to know about that night, about why I had to—" The letter ended there, the ink smeared as if Samuel had been interrupted or changed his mind. But it confirmed Jed's growing suspicion that his brother's disappearance had been calculated, not accidental. Briscoe barked sharply, his attention fixed on something outside. Jed moved to the window and peered through the frost-glazed glass. 3 riders were making their way up the narrow trail that led to his cabin, their horses picking their way carefully through the snow. Visitors were rare in winter, and rarer still were those who came in numbers. His hand found the rifle hanging above the door, an old habit from the early years when he'd jumped at every shadow. The weapon felt familiar in his grip, its weight both comforting and ominous. Through the window, he could see the riders more clearly now. 2 older men and a younger one, all dressed in the sturdy clothes of miners or ranchers. They didn't look like trouble, but Jed had learned long ago that appearances could deceive. The lead rider raised his hand in greeting as they approached the cabin. He was a big man, with iron-grey hair and the bearing of someone used to command. His companions seemed content to follow his lead, staying slightly behind as they reined in their horses 20 yards from the door. "Jebediah Calloway," the big man called out. "We need to talk." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. No one had called him by his full name in decades. The few people who knew he existed referred to him simply as the Hermit, or the Mountain Man, if they acknowledged him at all. These men knew exactly who he was. "You're on private land," Jed called back, not bothering to show himself. "State your business or move along." The big man dismounted, his movements careful and non-threatening. "My name is Marcus Webb. I believe you found something that belonged to my late partner." Samuel's partner, the name from the correspondence. Jed's grip tightened on the rifle as implications crashed through his mind. If these men knew about the strongbox, they'd been watching him, waiting for him to find it, perhaps. But how had they known where it was hidden? "Don't know what you're talking about," he replied, though his voice carried less conviction than he would have liked. Webb stepped closer, close enough for Jed to see the weathered kindness in his face and the genuine sadness in his eyes. "Samuel Calloway was my partner for 15 years. More than that, he was my friend. When he died 3 years ago, he made me promise to find you if anything happened to him. To tell you the truth about what really occurred that night in Virginia City, the admission that Samuel was truly dead hit Jed harder than he'd expected. Some part of him had been hoping, despite everything, that his brother might still be alive, somewhere, that there might be a chance for reconciliation, for explanations, for the healing of old wounds. "He's dead?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper. Webb nodded gravely. "Lung fever took him last winter. He fought it for months, but the mountain air couldn't save him in the end. Before he passed, he told me where he'd hidden that strongbox. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got the truth." Briscoe whined softly, sensing the grief that washed over Jed like a avalanche. 30 years of anger and isolation, and now he'd never get the answers he needed, never get the chance to confront his brother face to face, to demand explanations. For the years of suffering and solitude. "What truth?" he asked, though part of him feared the answer. Webb's expression grew grave. "The truth about why Samuel let you think he was dead. The truth about the men who are still looking for you, even after all these years. And the truth about what's in that strongbox that makes you the most wanted man in 3 territories." The world seemed to tilt around Jed as the weight of revelation pressed down on him. Whatever secret Samuel had died protecting, it was bigger than simple survival. It was something worth killing for, worth waiting 3 decades to claim. And now, whether he wanted it or not, that burden had passed to him. Against his better judgment, Jed found himself opening the cabin door. Marcus Webb stood in the snow, with his hat in his hands, the picture of respectful patience. His 2 companions remained by their horses, clearly following their leader's cues about how to handle a man who'd lived alone for 30 years. "Come in, then," Jed said, stepping aside. "But leave your weapons with your men." Webb nodded to his companions, who began unbuckling their gun belts without argument. The big man's own revolver joined the pile in the snow before he stepped across the threshold. Briscoe growled low in his throat, but made no move to attack, content to position himself between Jed and the stranger. Inside the cabin, Webb's eyes took in the sparse furnishings, the neat organization of a life lived by necessity rather than comfort. They lingered on the strongbox, sitting open on the table, its contents spread like evidence of some crime. When his gaze found the daguerreotype, his weathered face softened with what looked like genuine grief. "He was proud of that picture," Webb said quietly. "Talked about sending it to you a dozen times, but he was always afraid it would bring trouble." "To your door." "Trouble's already at my door," Jed replied, gesturing toward the window where Webb's men waited. "Question is whether you brought it or just followed it here." Webb settled into one of the wooden chairs without invitation, his movements careful and unthreatening. "Samuel told me about you, about the brother who could track a whisper through stone and smell danger 3 valleys away. He said you'd never trust easily, and he was right to warn me." From his coat, Webb produced a small leather pouch, setting it on the table beside the strongbox. Inside was a collection of items that made Jed's breath catch: a bent silver dollar that he'd carried for luck in his younger days, Samuel's old pocket watch, and a small carved wooden horse that their father had whittled for Samuel when he was 7 years old. "He kept these with him always," Webb explained. "Said they reminded him of what he'd sacrificed to keep you alive." Jed picked up the wooden horse, its familiar weight transporting him back to their childhood cabin in Missouri. He remembered his father's patient hands shaping the toy, Samuel's delight when it was finished, the way his brother had carried it everywhere despite their mother's complaints about wooden toys at the dinner table. "Tell me," Jed said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Tell me what really happened that night." Webb leaned forward, his hands clasped before him. "The men who came for you weren't just claim jumpers or simple thieves. They worked for a man named Silas Cord, a businessman out of Denver with interests in mining, railroads, and less savory enterprises. You and Samuel had stumbled onto something bigger than gold claims, a map showing the location of a government silver shipment that went missing during an Apache raid 5 years earlier. The memory came flooding back. They'd found the map in the belongings of a dying prospector, a man who'd rambled about soldiers and silver and hidden caches before fever took him. Samuel had been excited by the find, but Jed had been skeptical. Maps to lost treasure were common as fleas in mining camps, and usually worth about as much. "Samuel showed that map to the wrong people," Webb continued. "Cord's men heard about it and decided to take it for themselves. But they made a mistake. They assumed Samuel was the brains of the operation and you were just muscle. So they killed him to get to me," Jed said. "No," Webb shook his head. "They tried to kill both of you, but Samuel was faster than they expected. He managed to wound 2 of them and escape, but not before they'd shot him twice in the chest. He should have died. And that night would have, if not for Doc Peterson." Jed frowned. Peterson had been the camp doctor, a quiet man who asked no questions and took payment in gold dust rather than coin. Peterson was there. Samuel crawled to his cabin after the shooting, barely alive. Peterson patched him up, but he knew Cord's men would be back to finish the job. So they came up with a plan. Webb's expression grew grim. They found a body, a drifter who died of pneumonia a few days earlier. Similar build to Samuel, face damaged enough from the disease that identification would be difficult. Peterson performed surgery that night, removing the bullets from Samuel's chest and putting them in the corpse. The implications hit Jed like a physical blow. "The body I buried wasn't your brother." Samuel was hidden in Peterson's root cellar, barely clinging to life. When you found the scene the next morning, you saw exactly what they wanted you to. See your brother's clothes, his blood, and a body that looked convincing enough in poor light. Jed felt the world tilting around him again. He'd mourned over a stranger's grave while his brother recovered in secret. But why? Why not tell me? Because Cord's men were watching you, Webb said simply. They knew you'd seen the map too, and they wanted it back. Samuel realized that as long as you thought he was dead, you'd run, you'd disappear into the mountains where they couldn't follow, and you'd be safe. Safe, Jed repeated bitterly. 30 years alone in the wilderness. That's what he called safe. It kept you alive, Webb pointed out. Cord's been looking for you ever since, but a dead brother can't reveal the location of hidden treasure. Samuel's sacrifice bought you time, and more than that, it bought you freedom. Briscoe padded over to rest his head on Jed's knee, sensing his distress. The simple gesture of comfort from his loyal companion helped anchor him as the revelations continued to reshape everything he thought he knew about his life. The map, Jed said. What happened to it? Webb smiled grimly. Samuel memorized it before the attack, then destroyed the original. Over the next 15 years, he used that information to build his mining empire, but he never retrieved the silver shipment itself. Said that belonged to you, since you'd found the map together. And now? Now Silas Cord is dead, killed in a railroad accident 2 years ago. But his son Marcus has taken over the family business, and he's even more ruthless than his father ever was. When Samuel got sick last year, he started making preparations. He knew time was running out, and he wanted to make sure you got your inheritance. Webb gestured toward the strongbox. Everything in there. The mining claims, the gold, the location of the silver cache. It's all yours now. Samuel spent 30 years building a fortune that rightfully belonged to both of you. The weight of responsibility settled on Jed's shoulders like a lead blanket. For 3 decades, he'd lived simply, taking only what he needed from the land and giving thanks for each day of survival. Now he was being offered wealth beyond imagination, but it came with dangers he'd spent his entire adult life avoiding. And if I don't want it, he asked. Webb's expression grew serious. Then young Marcus Cord will eventually find you anyway. Samuel's death has stirred up old questions, old grudges. There are people asking where Jebediah Calloway might be hiding, what he might know about his brother's sudden wealth. Your isolation won't protect you much longer. Outside, the wind was picking up, whistling through the pines with the promise of another storm. Inside the cabin, 2 men sat surrounded by the evidence of 3 decades of deception and sacrifice, while a loyal dog sensed the approaching change in their quiet life. Jed looked at the wooden horse in his hands, remembering his brother's laughter and his father's patient craftsmanship. The past was more complicated than he'd ever imagined, but the future was becoming terrifyingly clear. He was no longer just a hermit hiding from old wounds. Whether he wanted it or not, he'd become the heir to a fortune and all the dangers that came with it. The storm Webb had predicted arrived with the fury of 30 years' worth of suppressed truth. Snow drove against the cabin windows in sheets, while the wind howled through the pines like the voices of the dead demanding justice. Inside, the 3 men huddled around the fire as Webb continued his revelations, each word reshaping Jed's understanding of his life. There's something else, Webb said, producing a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket. Samuel wrote this just before he died, made me swear to give it to you only after you knew the truth. The paper was newer than the other documents, written in Samuel's hand, but with the shaky quality of serious illness. Jed unfolded it carefully, his brother's final words swimming before his eyes in the firelight. Jed, if you're reading this, then Marcus has found you and told you the truth I was too coward to tell myself. I know 30 years is a long time to carry a lie, but I convinced myself it was the only way to keep you safe. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was just afraid to face what I'd done to both our lives. The silver cache is real. It's hidden in Devil's Canyon, 3 days north of where you're sitting now, in a cave behind the old mining camp they called Perdition. The entrance is marked with 3 stones, stacked like a cairn. Inside, you'll find enough silver to buy half of Montana territory. It was always meant to be ours, yours and mine together. But there's a price on that silver, brother. Young Marcus Cord isn't the only one who wants it. The government knows it exists, and they've never stopped looking. There are Apache who consider it blood money for their fallen warriors. And there are others, men Samuel worked with over the years, who knew pieces of the story and have been waiting for their chance. I tried to protect you by staying away. But dying has a way of stirring up old secrets. Take what's yours, Jed, but be careful who you trust. The mountains that kept you safe for 30 years won't hide you much longer. Your brother always, Samuel. Webb waited patiently while Jed read the letter twice, processing each revelation. Devil's Canyon was familiar territory. He'd trapped there for years without knowing he was working ground that sat on a fortune. The irony wasn't lost on him. How much? Jed asked finally. Silver, Webb calculated in his head. Samuel estimated maybe $40,000 worth, based on the manifest from the original shipment. That was 30 years ago. Today's prices, you're looking at triple that amount, maybe more. More money than Jed had seen in his entire lifetime, more than most men could spend in several lifetimes. But the number felt abstract, meaningless in the context of his simple existence. What use was silver to a man who measured wealth in successful trap lines and full food stores? And the mining claims? He asked. Those are worth considerably more, Webb admitted. Samuel built his empire carefully, buying up claims along proven veins. The paperwork in that strongbox represents controlling interest in 6 major operations across Colorado and Montana. Conservative estimate puts it at 200,000, maybe more with the right development. Briscoe lifted his head from where he'd been dozing by the fire, ears pricked toward the door. His low growl brought immediate tension to the cabin as all 3 men turned toward the sound that had alerted him. Through the storm's noise came the unmistakable sound of horses moving through snow. More than the 2 Webb's companions were watching outside. Webb was on his feet instantly, his hand moving toward the revolver that wasn't there. That's not my men, he said grimly. We would have heard their signal. Jed was already moving toward his rifle, 30 years of mountain survival instincts taking over. He motioned for Webb to stay low while he positioned himself at the window. Through the driving snow, he could make out at least 4 riders approaching the cabin, their shapes barely visible in the white chaos of the storm. Friends of yours? He asked Webb, though the man's pale expression already provided the answer. Could be Cord's men, Webb replied. I thought we'd lost them in Colorado, but they're persistent. Or it might be someone else entirely. Word has a way of getting around about valuable discoveries. The riders stopped just beyond rifle range, clearly aware they were being watched. One of them dismounted and began walking toward the cabin, his hands visible, but his intentions unclear. Jed could see enough through the snow to recognize the man's expensive coat and confident bearing. Not the dress of a simple bounty hunter, or claim jumper, Jebediah Calloway. The man called out, his voice carrying despite the wind. My name is Thomas Cord. I believe you have something that belongs to my family. Samuel's final enemy had found him. All the years of isolation, all the careful precautions, had come to nothing in the end. Jed felt a familiar cold settle in his chest. Not the mountain cold he'd grown accustomed to, but the deadly chill that had kept him alive through countless dangers in his younger days. Your father's been dead for years, Jed called back. His claims died with him. Not the claims, Thomas replied. The map, the information that helped your brother build his fortune while my father spent a lifetime, looking for what was rightfully ours. Webb cursed softly under his breath. Samuel was right to worry. This one's smarter than his father, more patient. He's been tracking every lead since Samuel died. From his coat, Webb produced a small derringer. Apparently not all his weapons had been left outside. There's a back way out through the root cellar, he whispered. I can hold them here while you escape. But Jed was already shaking his head. He'd run once before, 30 years ago, and spent 3 decades paying the price for it. This time would be different. Briscoe, he said quietly. The dog moved to his side immediately, reading his intentions in that uncanny way animals possess. We're not running anymore, old friend. Outside, Thomas Cord was growing impatient. "I'm prepared to make you a fair offer, Calloway. Half the silver cash for information about its location. You can keep the mining claims. I'm not interested in legitimate business, and if I refuse, then we'll burn you out and take our chances finding it ourselves. Either way, your hermit days are over." Jed looked around the cabin that had been his sanctuary for so many years. The simple furnishings, the journal chronicling his transformation, the collection of traps and tools that had kept him alive through brutal winters. This place represented everything he'd built from the ashes of his old life, humble perhaps, but honest and peaceful. Now that peace was ending, whether he wanted it to or not. From the strongbox, he took Samuel's old pocket watch, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. His brother had carried this timepiece through years of deception and sacrifice, building a fortune while protecting a brother who hated him for betrayals that had never happened. "What do you want to do?" Webb asked quietly. Jed tucked the watch into his coat pocket and picked up his rifle. After 30 years of hiding from the past, it was time to face it head-on. But this time, he wouldn't face it alone, and he wouldn't be running. The standoff stretched through the howling wind as Jed weighed his options. Thomas Cord waited in the snow with the patience of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, while his men formed a loose circle around the cabin. They were professionals, Jed realized, not the rough claim jumpers or desperate bounty hunters he'd expected, but men who moved with military precision despite the storm. "There's a fourth option," Webb said quietly, studying the deployment through a gap in the shutters. Samuel left more than just mining claims and silver locations. He left contingency plans. From inside his coat, Webb produced a leather portfolio that had been concealed beneath his vest. The artifact was unremarkable at first glance. Brown, leather worn smooth by handling, tied with a simple cord. But as he opened it, Jed saw it contained detailed maps, correspondence, and what looked like legal documents bearing official seals. "Your brother was many things, but he was never unprepared," Webb explained, spreading the contents on the table beside the strongbox. "When he realized his health was failing, he made arrangements. Friends in Denver, allies in the territorial government, men who owed him favors or shared his interests." One of the maps showed the Montana Territory, with several locations marked in red ink. Jed recognized some of them: trading posts, small settlements, the kind of places where a man could disappear if he knew the right people. Others were unfamiliar, marked with symbols that meant nothing to him, but apparently held significance for Samuel. "Safe houses," Webb explained, following his gaze. "Places where Samuel's people can provide shelter, supplies, or assistance." He spent years building a network of contacts, preparing for the day when his past might catch up with him. A letter bearing the seal of the territorial marshal caught Jed's attention. The correspondence was addressed to Monsieur Webb, authorized, agent, and signed by someone named J. Harrison. The content was brief but significant. Upon presentation of proper documentation, bearer is authorized to request federal assistance in matters pertaining to the recovery of government property stolen during Apache raids of 1873-1875. All territorial and federal law enforcement agencies are directed to provide cooperation as needed. "Samuel got you a federal warrant?" Jed asked, incredulous. "Better than that," Webb replied. "He convinced the government that recovering the silver cash was in the national interest. Officially, you're not a fugitive anymore. You're a federal contractor helping to recover stolen property." The implications were staggering. For 30 years, Jed had lived as an outlaw in his own mind, hiding from justice that had never actually been seeking him. Now, through Samuel's careful planning, he found himself on the right side of the law for the first time since that terrible night in Virginia City. Outside, Thomas Cord was growing impatient. "I'm going to count to 10, Calloway. Then my men are going to start shooting, and we'll sort out the details afterward." "He's bluffing," Webb said, but his voice carried uncertainty. "Killing you doesn't get him what he wants, doesn't it?" Jed studied the young man through the window. Thomas Cord had his father's ruthless eyes, but seemed to lack the older man's patience. "If I'm dead, who's to stop him from searching Devil's Canyon himself?" "The Apache, for one," Webb replied grimly. "Samuel's letter mentioned them for a reason. That silver shipment was taken during a raid that cost them 12 warriors. They consider it blood money, sacred to the memory of their dead. Any white man who disturbs it without proper arrangements is asking for a war." Briscoe suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked toward the back of the cabin. His alert stance suggested he'd detected something the men had missed, movement where there shouldn't be any. Jed followed the dog's gaze and realized with cold certainty that Cord's men were more sophisticated than he'd credited. While their leader held his attention at the front door, others were moving to surround the cabin completely. "They're boxing us in," he told Webb. "Professional work." Webb nodded grimly. Thomas learned from his father's mistakes. Silas always tried to handle these situations with brute force. The son prefers thorough planning. From the portfolio, Webb pulled out another document, a hand-drawn map of the local area with notations in Samuel's careful script. It showed the cabin's location in relation to several escape routes, including the root cellar passage Webb had mentioned earlier. But more interesting were the symbols marking various defensive positions Samuel had apparently prepared over the years during his visits to check on his brother's welfare. He was here, Jed realized, studying the detailed knowledge the map represented. "Samuel came to see me many times," Webb admitted, "always from a distance, always careful not to let you know. He couldn't resist checking on you, making sure you were surviving the winters, noting potential threats or escape routes. He felt responsible for your exile." The revelation hit harder than Jed expected. While he'd been nursing his anger and isolation, Samuel had been watching over him like a guardian angel, preparing contingencies for dangers that might never come. The depth of his brother's care and guilt was staggering. "5!" Thomas called from outside, his countdown proceeding. With mechanical precision, Jed made his decision. 30 years of running had accomplished nothing except to delay this confrontation. But now he had advantages Samuel had provided: federal authority, detailed intelligence, and the moral certainty that came from finally understanding the truth. "Webb," he said, "how many men does Samuel's network have in this territory?" "Enough," Webb replied, "but it'll take time to contact them, and Cord isn't going to wait." "Then we don't wait either." Jed moved to a loose floorboard near the back wall, prying it up to reveal a cache he'd established years earlier. Inside were supplies he'd hoped never to need: extra ammunition, emergency food, and a second rifle he'd maintained, but rarely used. "What are you thinking?" Webb asked. "I'm thinking my brother spent 30 years preparing for this moment," Jed replied, checking the rifle's action. "Time to see if his planning was as good as his mining claims." From outside came Thomas's voice. "7!" Briscoe moved to Jed's side, reading his master's intentions with the uncanny perception that had kept them both alive through countless wilderness. Dangers. The dog's brown eyes held no fear, only loyalty and the quiet confidence that came from years of facing challenges together. Jed looked at the portfolio spread on his table. Samuel's final gift of preparation and possibility. His brother had given him more than just wealth. He'd given him the tools to fight back, to reclaim the life that had been stolen by lies and misunderstanding. 8. The storm outside was beginning to subside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tempest was building. For the first time in 30 years, Jebediah Calloway was preparing for war. 10! Thomas Cord's final number echoed across the snow-covered clearing, but instead of gunfire, an unexpected sound cut through the mountain air, the sharp whistle of a steam engine cutting through the storm. All heads turned toward the narrow valley that led to Jed's hidden refuge, where the impossible sight of a locomotive emerged from the white chaos like a mechanical ghost. "What in blazes?" one of Cord's men called out, his weapon momentarily forgotten in the face of this unprecedented arrival. Webb smiled grimly. "Samuel's contingency plan." He arranged for the territorial marshal to have a special train on standby, just in case his brother needed federal assistance. The locomotive was a small but powerful mountain engine, designed for steep grades and narrow tracks. Behind it rolled a single passenger car and what appeared to be a freight wagon modified for rapid deployment. As it ground to a halt in a cloud of steam and cinders, armed men began pouring out with the efficiency of a military operation. But Jed's attention was captured by something else entirely. A small wooden chest that had fallen from Webb's portfolio when the man jumped at the train's arrival. The artifact was no larger than a jewelry box, carved from what looked like mountain pine and bound with strips of weathered leather. Something about its careful construction and obvious age suggested it held more than mere trinkets. "What's in there?" Jed asked, nodding toward the chest. Webb's expression grew solemn as he retrieved it. Samuel's real legacy. The thing he valued more than all the silver and mining claims combined. Inside the chest, wrapped in soft cloth, were 3 items that stopped Jed's breath. A faded photograph of their parents, standing together in front of the Missouri cabin where they'd grown up. A small Bible that had belonged to their mother, its pages worn soft by decades of handling. And a letter in their father's distinctive handwriting, dated just a week before his death. The letter was addressed to both brothers, Samuel and Jebediah. "By the time you read this, I'll likely be with your mother in whatever comes after this life. I want you boys to know that everything I taught you about honor, loyalty, and protecting family wasn't just words to fill empty evenings. A man's character is measured not by the gold in his pocket, but by the lengths he'll go to protect those he loves. You're different men with different strengths, but you're bound by blood and by the values your mother and I tried to instill. Whatever trials may come, whatever distances may separate you, remember that family is the only treasure worth fighting for. Take care of each other, boys. That's all an old man can ask. Your father always." Outside, the situation was rapidly evolving. The federal marshals, for that's clearly what they were, had surrounded Cord's men with professional efficiency. Their leader, a tall man with a grey beard and the bearing of a career lawman, was approaching the cabin with his hands visible, but his authority unmistakable. "Jebediah Calloway," he called out. "Marshal James Harrison, Territorial Federal Service. We received word you might need assistance with a matter of national interest." Webb opened the cabin door, his federal warrant already in hand. "Marshal Harrison, thank you for responding so quickly. We have a situation here involving the recovery of government property stolen in 1873. Harrison's eyes swept the scene, taking in the armed standoff with the practiced assessment of a man who'd defused countless volatile situations. His gaze lingered on Thomas Cord, who stood amid his men with the frustrated expression of a predator whose prey had suddenly grown teeth. "Mr. Cord," Harrison said with cold politeness, "I should have known you'd be involved in this. Your father, who caused us considerable trouble over the years with his unauthorized treasure hunting." "This is a private matter, Marshal," Thomas replied, though his confidence was clearly shaken by the federal intervention. "A business dispute over mining claims." "Not according to my information," Harrison replied, producing a thick folder from his coat. "According to federal records, you're interfering with the recovery of stolen government silver. That makes it very much a federal matter." Jed emerged from the cabin, the wooden chest tucked under one arm and his rifle held loosely in the other. 30 years of isolation had taught him to read dangerous situations, and this one was rapidly shifting in unexpected directions. The presence of federal marshals should have simplified things, but Thomas Cord's expression suggested he had cards yet to play. "There's something else," Webb said quietly, moving to Jed's side. "Samuel discovered something in his final months, something that changes everything about that silver shipment." From the wooden chest, he withdrew a final document that had been hidden beneath the family mementos. It was an official army report, stamped with military seals and signed by a Colonel Morrison. The content was explosive. Following investigation, into the Apache raid of September 15, 1873. This office has determined that the attack was not random, but was instigated by information provided by civilian contractors working for private interests. Evidence suggests the raiders were deliberately directed to the silver shipment by parties unknown, with the intention of creating a justification for increased military action against Apache settlements. Further investigation recommended into the activities of Silas Cord and Associates, who appear to have profited significantly from subsequent government contracts awarded in response to the Apache threat. "Your father didn't just want the silver," Jed said, understanding dawning in his voice. "He orchestrated the entire raid." Thomas. Cord's face went pale, but his hand moved slowly toward his weapon. "That's impossible. My father was a legitimate businessman." "Your father was a war profiteer," Marshal Harrison said flatly, having read over Jed's shoulder. "This report explains why the government has been so interested in recovering that silver. It's not just about the money, it's about exposing a conspiracy that led to the deaths of soldiers and civilians on both sides." The wooden chest represented more than Samuel's sentimental attachments to family. It contained the evidence that would finally bring justice for crimes that had echoed through 3 decades. Samuel had spent his final years not just building a fortune, but building a case that would vindicate everyone who'd suffered because of Silas Cord's manipulation. Briscoe growled low, sensing the sudden tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a lightning strike. Thomas Cord was trapped between federal marshals and the truth about his father's crimes, but cornered animals were always the most dangerous. "This isn't over, Calloway," Thomas said, his voice carrying the cold promise of future violence. "The silver is still out there, and I have resources you can't imagine." "Actually," Marshal Harrison said with satisfaction, "it is over. You're under arrest for conspiracy to interfere with federal recovery operations. Your resources just became the government's concern." But even as the marshals moved to apprehend Cord and his men, Jed felt no sense of victory. The wooden chest had revealed the truth about his family's values and his father's expectations, but it had also shown him the depths of corruption that had shaped his life. Samuel had died protecting not just a brother, but evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of territorial politics and military contracting. The storm outside was ending, but Jed sensed that larger tempests were just beginning. The simple life he'd built in the mountains was finished forever, replaced by responsibilities he'd never asked for and dangers he was only beginning to understand. The federal marshals had barely finished securing Thomas Cord and his men when a new complication emerged from the storm's dissipating fury. A lone rider approached from the north, moving with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle. As the figure drew closer, Jed could see it was an Apache warrior, his face painted for war and his rifle held with casual menace. "Marshal," Webb said quietly, "we may have another problem." But the warrior raised his hand in a gesture of peace, calling out in accented but clear English, "I seek the white man called Calloway. I would speak with the brother of Samuel." Harrison's hand moved to his weapon, but Jed stepped forward. 30 years in the mountains had taught him to recognize the difference between threat and negotiation, and this man's bearing suggested the latter. "I'm Jebediah Calloway," he replied. "What do you want with me?" The warrior dismounted with fluid grace, his eyes taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to reading complex situations. He was older than Jed had first assumed, his hair streaked with gray and his face marked by the lines that came from years of leadership and hard decisions. "My name is Joseph Standing Bear," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I am war chief of the Chiricahua band. Your brother and I had an understanding about the silver taken from our dead warriors." The revelation hit the assembled men like a physical blow. Samuel hadn't just hidden the location of the government silver, he'd been negotiating with the Apache, who considered it blood money. The complexity of the situation was expanding beyond anything Jed had imagined. "What kind of understanding?" Marshal Harrison asked, his professional instincts warring with territorial politics that could explode if handled incorrectly. Standing Bear reached into his coat and withdrew an object that made Jed's breath catch. A ceremonial tomahawk, its handle wrapped in beaded leather and its blade etched with symbols that spoke of sacred significance. But it was the small metal plate attached to the handle that captured everyone's attention, for it bore an inscription in Samuel's familiar handwriting: "Treaty of Honor between Samuel Calloway and Chief Standing Bear, witnessed by the spirits of the fallen." The silver taken in the raid of September Moon belongs to the Apache people, payment for bloodshed by deception. When the truth is known, the silver shall be returned with interest, and the white man's debt to the Chiricahua shall be paid in full. "Samuel gave you his word," Jed said, understanding flooding through him. "The silver isn't just government property, it's Apache by right of conquest and blood debt." Standing Bear nodded gravely. "Your brother was the first white man to understand that our warriors died because of lies told by other white men. The silver they died protecting became sacred to their memory. Samuel promised that when the truth came to light, justice would be served." Thomas Cord, despite being in federal custody, couldn't contain his outrage. "You can't seriously be considering giving government silver to savages based on the word of a dead man." The tomahawk moved faster than the eye could follow, its blade stopping just short of Cord's throat. Standing Bear's eyes held the cold fire of a man who'd lost friends and family to the conspiracy now being revealed. "Your father's lies killed 12 of my warriors," he said with deadly quiet. "They died believing they were protecting their people from soldiers who came to steal what little we had left. The silver they took was payment for bloodshed in a war your father created for." In profit, Marshal Harrison stepped carefully between the two men, his diplomatic skills tested by a situation that could easily spiral into violence. "Chief Standing Bear, I understand your people's grievance, but federal law..." "Federal law?" Standing Bear's laugh was bitter. "The same federal law that allowed Silas Cord to profit from the deaths of my people? The same law that gave him contracts to supply the army that hunted us because of raids he helped plan." Webb cleared his throat, drawing attention to another document from Samuel's collection. "Actually, there's more. Samuel spent years researching territorial law and federal treaties. What he found might surprise everyone." The document he produced was a copy of the Treaty of Bosque Redondo, signed in 1868 between the United States government and various Apache bands. Hidden in its complex language was a clause that had apparently escaped notice for years: provisions for compensation when government property was taken during conflicts initiated by civilian interference in military operations. If it can be proven that the raid was instigated by civilian contractors acting against government interests, Webb read aloud, "any property taken during such conflicts shall be considered compensation for damages to be distributed according to tribal custom and federal oversight." Samuel found the legal loophole, Jed realized. "The silver belongs to the Apache under federal law if we can prove his father orchestrated the raid." Standing Bear studied the document with interest, his expression suggesting he understood its implications better than most would have credited. "Your brother was a man of honor. He spent many moons learning our ways, understanding why the silver had become sacred to us. When he grew sick, he sent word that his brother would complete what he had started." The weight of expectations settled on Jed's shoulders like a mountain avalanche. Not only was he inheriting Samuel's wealth and the government's interest in recovering their property, but he was also bound by his brother's promise to make amends for his father's crimes against the Apache people. "There's something else," Standing Bear continued, producing a leather pouch from his saddle. Inside were items that made the gathered men step back in awe, Apache artifacts of obvious ceremonial importance, but also something that changed everything. They thought they knew about the silver cache. A second map, drawn on treated hide in Apache pictographs, showing the location of not one, but 3 separate caches. The government silver was apparently only part of what the warriors had taken during their raid. The other caches contained items of spiritual significance to the Apache, sacred objects that had been in the possession of the army for reasons that were becoming increasingly unclear. "The soldiers your father sent to die," Standing Bear said, his voice heavy with old grief. "They were not just carrying silver. They had taken sacred objects from our burial grounds, artifacts meant to be sold to collectors in the East. My warriors died to recover what was never meant to be taken." The true scope of Silas Cord's conspiracy was finally becoming clear. He hadn't just orchestrated a raid to steal government silver, he'd been trafficking in Apache sacred objects, using his government contracts to legitimize grave robbing and cultural theft on an unprecedented scale. "Sweet Jesus," Marshal Harrison whispered, his professional composure finally cracking. "This goes all the way to Washington. The implications, Standing Bear interrupted, "are that my people have been patient long enough. Samuel promised justice and restitution. His brother will honor that promise, or the Chiricahua will seek satisfaction in our own way." Jed looked at the ceremonial tomahawk in Standing Bear's hands, understanding that it represented more than just a treaty token. It was a symbol of trust given to Samuel and now passed to him, but it was also a weapon that could just as easily be used if that trust was broken. Briscoe pressed against his leg, sensing the enormous weight of decision that had settled on his master's shoulders. The dog's simple presence reminded Jed of his father's words about protecting family. But now he was being asked to honor debts that extended far beyond blood relations. "Chief Standing Bear," he said finally, "I'll honor my brother's promise, but I'll need your help to do it right." The Apache war chief studied him for a long moment, searching for the same character he'd apparently found in Samuel. Finally, he nodded with the gravity of a man sealing a pact that could determine the fate of both their peoples. "Then we go to Devil's Canyon together," Standing Bear said. "The spirits of the dead have waited long enough for justice." As the storms last, clouds cleared from the mountain sky, Jed realized that everything he'd thought he understood about his situation had been wrong. He wasn't just inheriting his brother's wealth, he was inheriting the responsibility to heal wounds that reached back decades and affected far more people than he'd ever imagined. The ceremonial tomahawk would be his guide and his burden, a reminder that some promises transcended death and that justice delayed was not justice denied. The journey to Devil's Canyon took 2 days through terrain that tested both man and beast. Jed rode alongside Chief Standing Bear, while Marshal Harrison and a small contingent of federal agents followed at a respectful distance. Webb had remained behind to coordinate with territorial authorities, leaving Jed with a final gift: a compass that had belonged to Samuel, its brass case engraved with coordinates that matched the Apache map perfectly. The compass was more than a navigation tool. It was Samuel's final insurance policy. Hidden within its mechanism was a coded message that only revealed itself when the compass was opened at specific coordinates. As they made camp on the first night, Jed discovered the secret: tiny notches carved into the compass face that, when aligned with the North Star, spelled out a warning in Morse code. Danger follows. Trust only blood and honor. The cache is guarded. By more than stone. Standing Bear noticed Jed's sudden tension as he decoded the message. "Your brother was wise to leave warnings," the Apache chief said, adding wood to their campfire. "The spirits of that place are restless. Too much blood has been spilled over what lies hidden there." "You've been to Devil's Canyon before?" Jed asked. "Many times. My grandfather's grandfather fought there against other tribes, long before white. Men came to these mountains. The canyon has always been a place where the living must reckon with the dead." Standing Bear's eyes reflected the firelight as he spoke. When my warriors took the silver and sacred objects from your father's soldiers, they hid them in caves that were already sacred to us. It seemed fitting. White man's greed buried in red man's holy ground. Marshal Harrison approached their fire, his official demeanor softened by the isolation of the mountains. Mr. Calloway, I should warn you that Washington is very interested in what we find up there. The implications of your brother's evidence could reach all the way to Congress. What kind of implications? Jed asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Silas Cord wasn't working alone. The trafficking of Apache sacred objects, the manipulation of military operations, the falsified reports about Apache raids, it all required cooperation from people in positions of authority. We're looking at corruption that could implicate territorial governors, army officers, maybe even federal legislators. Standing Bear smiled grimly. Your white man's justice moves slowly, but it moves. Samuel understood this. He spent years gathering not just evidence of his father's crimes, but proof of everyone who helped him. The second day brought them to the mouth of Devil's Canyon, a narrow gorge that split the mountains like an axe wound. The walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, creating a natural fortress that had sheltered secrets for generations. Ancient pictographs decorated the stone faces, telling stories of battles and ceremonies that predated written history. There, Standing Bear pointed to a section of the canyon wall where 3 stones had been stacked in a cairn, just as Samuel's letter had described. But Jed could see immediately that something was wrong. The stones had been disturbed recently, and there were signs that someone else had been exploring the area. We're not the first ones here, Marshal Harrison observed, his hand moving instinctively. To his weapon! No, Standing Bear agreed, his voice carrying the tension of a hunter who discovered competing predators in his territory. But whoever came before us did not find what they sought, or they would not have left such obvious signs of their search. As they approached the cave entrance, more evidence of previous visitors became apparent. Boot prints in the sandy soil, the remains of a recent campfire, and most ominously bloodstains on the rocks near the cave mouth. Thomas Cord, Jed said with certainty. He must have had the location all along, probably from his father's papers. But something went wrong. Inside the cave, they found confirmation of Jed's suspicions. The sacred silver cache had been partially disturbed, with some of the government bars missing, but the Apache ceremonial objects left untouched. More telling were the signs of a violent struggle, bullet holes in the cave walls, more bloodstains, and the unmistakable evidence that someone had fled in desperate haste. Standing Bear knelt beside a pile of scattered bones, his expression growing grave. These are the remains of my warriors, killed in the original raid 30 years ago. Someone brought them here for proper burial, but the ceremony was interrupted. From a leather pouch, the Apache chief withdrew an object that made Jed's blood run cold, a military dog tag bearing the name Sergeant William Morrison, 7th Cavalry. The same Morrison who had signed the report identifying Silas Cord as a conspirator. Samuel brought proof, Standing Bear explained. This soldier survived the raid that killed my warriors. He lived long enough to tell the truth about what really happened that day. How civilian contractors led the Apache to the silver shipment, how the attack was planned to justify increased military spending, how men died for another man's profit. The compass in Jed's hand began to vibrate strangely, its needle spinning wildly before settling on a direction that had nothing to do with magnetic north. Following its guidance deeper into the cave system, they discovered the true scope of Samuel's final preparations. Hidden behind a false wall of carefully stacked stones was a chamber that took Jed's breath away. The walls were lined with wooden crates containing not just the missing government silver, but documentation that chronicled 30 years of investigation. Samuel had spent his fortune and his final years building an unassailable case against everyone who had profited from the Apache raids. But it was the chamber's centerpiece that revealed the full magnitude of his brother's sacrifice. On a stone altar, Surrounded by Apache ceremonial objects that glowed with spiritual significance, lay Samuel's final letter, not to Jed, but to the spirits of the warriors who had died because of lies and greed. Brothers of the Chiricahua, the letter began, in Samuel's careful script, I offer my life's work as payment for the debt my silence created. Though I was not the architect of your betrayal, I profited from the silver taken by your blood. Let this evidence serve justice, and let your spirits find peace, knowing that the truth will finally be heard. Standing Bear read the letter with growing emotion, his weathered hands trembling as he reached the final paragraph. To my brother Jebediah, who will read these words if my plans succeed. The compass will guide you not just to treasure, but to the truth that must be shared with the world. The sacred objects belong to the Chiricahua people. The silver belongs to justice. Use both wisely, for the ghosts of the past are watching. Jed realized with stunning clarity that his brother's final years hadn't been spent building a fortune for personal gain. Every claim purchase, every business partnership, every dollar of profit had been directed toward this moment, the complete exposure of a conspiracy that had shaped territorial politics for 3 decades. There's more, Marshal. Harrison called from deeper in the chamber. He had discovered a final cache of documents, these bearing the seal of the War Department and the signature of officials whose names would be front-page news in every territorial newspaper. But as they examined Samuel's evidence, a sound from the cave entrance made them all freeze. Footsteps, moving with the cautious precision of men who expected trouble. Thomas Cord had somehow escaped federal custody, and he'd brought friends. "Calloway!" Cord's voice echoed through the cave system. "I know you're in there. My father's map showed me the same entrance your brother used. The difference is, I brought enough men to make sure I leave with what's mine." The compass in Jed's hand had stopped vibrating, its needle now pointing steadily toward a passage they hadn't yet explored. Samuel's final guidance, leading them deeper into the mountain rather than back toward the entrance where armed men waited. "Chief," Jed said quietly, "how well do you know these caves?" Standing Bear smiled with the confidence of a man fighting on ground his ancestors had blessed. "Well enough. Your brother was not the only one who made preparations for this day." From his pack, the Apache chief withdrew items that revealed the true scope of the alliance Samuel had forged: war paint, traditional weapons, and a ceremonial war bonnet that marked him as more than just a negotiator. He was a war leader preparing for battle on sacred ground. "The spirits of my warriors have waited 30 years for justice," Standing Bear said, his voice carrying the authority of ancient tradition and righteous anger. "Today, they will have it." As Cord's men began their descent into the cave system, Jed understood that the climax of his 30-year journey was about to unfold in the very place where the original conspiracy had claimed its first victims. The compass would guide them through passages known only to the Apache, while Samuel's evidence would ensure that whatever happened in these caves, the truth would survive. Briscoe pressed against his leg, ready to follow wherever the path might lead. The loyal dog had been his only companion through 3 decades of exile, and now he would be witness to the final confrontation that would either vindicate Samuel's sacrifice or bury the truth forever in Devil's Canyon. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, but Jed felt no fear. For the first time in 30 years, he knew exactly who he was fighting for and why the battle mattered. Justice delayed was not justice denied. Sometimes it was justice perfected. The passage Samuel's compass led them through was barely wide, enough for a man's shoulders, carved by centuries of water flow through the mountain's heart. Behind them, the sounds of Cord's men grew fainter as they followed the ancient path deeper into the cave system. Ahead, Standing Bear moved with the silent confidence of a man traveling roads his ancestors had blessed. "Here," the Apache chief whispered, stopping at what appeared to be a solid wall of stone. But when he pressed against a specific section, The rock pivoted inward to reveal a hidden chamber that took Jed's breath away. The room beyond was vast, its walls decorated with pictographs that glowed in the light of their torches. But it was the chamber's contents that commanded attention. Dozens of wooden crates arranged in careful rows, each one marked with symbols that identified its contents. Government silver, Apache ceremonial objects, and something else that made Marshal Harrison curse softly under his breath. "Sweet Jesus," the Marshal whispered. "These aren't just military supplies." The crates bore the markings of the Smithsonian Institution, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and private collectors whose names were familiar from newspaper society pages. Silas Cord's trafficking operation had been even more extensive than they'd imagined, involving the systematic looting of Apache burial sites and the sale of sacred objects to the highest bidders. Standing Bear approached one of the crates with reverent care, his weathered hands trembling as he lifted items that had been missing from his people for decades. "My grandfather's war lance," he whispered, "the sacred mask of the wind spirits, medicine bundles that were blessed by shamans who died before I was born. But it was the final artifact that stopped them all cold. A war shield decorated with eagle feathers and painted with symbols that seemed to pulse with spiritual energy." As Standing Bear lifted it from its resting place, the compass in Jed's hand began to vibrate again, its needle spinning wildly before pointing directly at the shield. "The shield of many battles," Standing Bear said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It belonged to my great-grandfather, who carried it in the fight against Mexican soldiers 50 years ago. We thought it was destroyed when the army burned our winter camp. Carved into the shield's leather surface were notches that matched the engravings on Samuel's compass." Jed realized with growing wonder that his brother had been following clues left by Apache warriors decades earlier, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to this moment of restoration and justice. The sound of gunfire echoed through the cave system, growing closer as Cord's men found their way through the passages. But Standing Bear seemed unconcerned, his attention focused on the sacred objects that had been returned to him after so many years of loss. "Your brother understood something most white men never learn," he said, strapping the ancient shield to his arm. "Some things are worth more than gold or silver. Some debts can only be paid with honor." Marshal Harrison was frantically examining the documentation found with the artifacts, bills of sale, shipping manifests, correspondence that revealed a network of corruption reaching from territorial capitals to Washington drawing rooms. "This evidence will bring down half the territorial government," he said in amazement. "That was Samuel's plan," Jed replied, understanding finally dawning. "He didn't spend 30 years building a mining empire. He spent 30 years building a case that would destroy everyone who profited from Apache blood." The compass needle suddenly stopped spinning, pointing toward a passage they hadn't yet explored. From its depths came the sound of running water and something else. Voices singing in a language Jed didn't recognize, but somehow understood as profoundly sacred. "The spirits of my warriors," Standing Bear said with certainty. "They sing the song of victory, of justice finally served. The sacred objects have been returned to sacred ground." But their moment of triumph was shattered by the appearance of Thomas Cord and 3 of his men at the chamber entrance, their weapons trained on the small group. Cord's face was bloody from his journey through the narrow passages, and his eyes held the desperate fury of a man whose family's legacy was crumbling around him. "Step away from those crates, Calloway," he snarled. "Whatever my father did, I'm not paying for his crimes. That silver represents my inheritance, and I'll kill anyone who tries to take it. Your inheritance," Standing Bear said with quiet dignity, "was built on the graves of my people. You have no claim here." Cord's laugh was bitter and desperate. "Claims, rights, you savages wouldn't know a legal contract if it bit you. This is white man's country now, and white man's law decides who gets what." The shield of many battles seemed to glow in the torchlight as Standing Bear stepped forward, his bearing transformed from negotiator to war chief. The sacred objects around him created an almost supernatural atmosphere that even Cord's men seemed to sense, their weapons wavering as ancestral power filled the chamber. "Your white man's law," Standing Bear replied, "says that stolen property must be returned to its rightful owners. Your white man's courts will decide your father's guilt. Your white man's marshals will decide your fate." Behind Cord, Marshal Harrison had been quietly positioning himself for action. But it was Briscoe who moved first, the loyal dog launching, himself at the gunman, furthest from Jed, with the protective instinct that had kept them both alive through countless wilderness dangers. The battle for Devil's Canyon and the truth it contained was about to begin. Briscoe's attack turned the chamber into chaos. The dog's unexpected assault sent one of Cord's men stumbling backward into the cave wall, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the stone ceiling. Marshal Harrison used the distraction to draw his weapon, while Standing Bear raised the shield of many battles, like an ancient warrior preparing for the battle that would define his legacy. But it was Jed who surprised everyone, including himself. 30 years of mountain survival had taught him to move like smoke when necessary, and he flowed across the chamber with deadly purpose. Samuel's compass became a weapon in his hand, its brass edge catching Thomas Cord across the temple before the younger man could react. "You want your father's inheritance?" Jed snarled, pressing his advantage as Cord staggered. "Then take responsibility for his crimes." The fight was brutal, but brief. Harrison's federal training made short work of 2 of Cord's hired guns, while Standing Bear wielded his ancestral shield with the skill of generations of warriors. The sacred objects seemed to lend strength to his movements, each block and strike carrying the weight of spiritual authority. Thomas Cord, blood streaming from his head wound, made one final desperate play. From his coat, he produced a stick of dynamite, its fuse already lit and sparking in the torchlight. "If I can't have the silver," he screamed, "then nobody can. This whole mountain will be your tomb." But he'd underestimated the Apache chief's reflexes. Standing Bear's tomahawk flew with perfect accuracy, severing Cord's wrist before he could throw the explosive. The dynamite fell to the cave floor, its fuse burning dangerously short. "Run!" Harrison shouted, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber's only exit was blocked by falling men and scattered equipment, and the dynamite's fuse was down to inches. It was Briscoe who saved them all. The faithful dog seized the dynamite in his jaws and bolted toward the water sound they'd heard earlier, disappearing into a passage none of the men had noticed. Seconds later, a muffled explosion echoed through the cave system, followed by the rush of underground water. Jed felt his heart stop. His companion of 8 years, the loyal friend who had led him to the truth and protected him at every turn, had sacrificed himself to save them all. The grief hit him like a physical blow, 30 years of carefully controlled emotions finally breaking through his mountain-hardened defenses. "Briscoe," he whispered, moving toward the passage where his dog had disappeared, but Standing Bear caught his arm, his weathered face showing understanding and compassion. "Wait," the Apache chief said gently. "Listen." Through the sound of rushing water came something impossible, a familiar bark, weak but unmistakably alive. Briscoe had found an underground stream that had carried him away from the explosion, and his cries echoed from somewhere deeper in the cave system. "He lives," Standing Bear said, with the certainty of a man who'd learned to read the mountain's voices. "The spirits protected him as they protected us. This is a sign that justice has been served." Thomas Cord lay unconscious in a pool of his own blood, his severed wrist bound by Marshal Harrison's field bandage. Around them, the evidence of 3 decades of corruption and crime waited to be carried into the light of justice. The sacred Apache objects glowed in the torchlight, finally returned to hands that would honor their spiritual significance. From his pack, Standing Bear withdrew the ceremonial tomahawk that had sealed his treaty with Samuel. He offered it to Jed with the gravity of a man passing leadership to a worthy successor. "Your brother's debt is paid," he said, "but the tomahawk remains a symbol of the bond between our peoples." Justice served, honor restored, family protected. Jed accepted the weapon with hands that shook from more than exertion. The tomahawk's weight represented not just Apache tradition, but his father's teachings about protecting family and Samuel's sacrifice to right the wrongs of the past. "What happens now?" he asked Harrison, who was securing the last of Cord's men. "Now we take this evidence to Washington," the marshal replied. "Your brother's investigation will expose corruption that reaches the highest levels of territorial government. There will be trials, resignations, probably a congressional investigation." And the Apache claims. Standing Bear smiled with the satisfaction of a man who'd seen justice delayed but not denied. "The federal treaty, your friend Webb, found guarantees our right to the silver and sacred objects. But more than that, Samuel's evidence proves our people were victims, not aggressors. History will remember the truth." As they prepared to leave Devil's Canyon, carrying the evidence that would reshape territorial politics and Apache relations, Jed felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that had nothing to do with physical burden. For 30 years, he'd carried the guilt of his brother's supposed betrayal. Now he understood that Samuel had spent those same years carrying the weight of necessary deception, building justice one careful step at a time. The sound of Briscoe's barking grew stronger as rescue efforts located the underground stream. The dog who had led them to the truth would survive to see justice served, just as Standing Bear had predicted. In his hands, the ceremonial tomahawk caught the torchlight like a promise kept. 6 months later, Jed stood on the porch of a cabin, very different from the one he'd called home for 30 years. This structure was larger, built not for survival, but for community, with extra rooms for the visitors who came regularly to consult with the man newspapers had dubbed the Hermit, who brought down a territory. Briscoe lay at his feet, the dog's left hind leg bearing permanent scars from his underground adventure, but his spirit undaunted. The explosion had cost him some mobility, but none of his loyalty, and he'd adapted to his limitations with the same resilience that had carried them both through decades of mountain life. In his hands, Jed held the morning edition of the Denver Post, its headlines proclaiming the conviction of the final defendant in what historians were already calling the Apache Silver Conspiracy. 3 territorial governors, a dozen army officers, and countless civilian contractors had faced justice for their roles in Silas Cord's network of corruption and grave robbery. Thomas Cord himself had received a sentence of 20 years for conspiracy and attempted murder, but more importantly, his family's assets had been seized to fund reparations for the Apache bands affected by his father's crimes. The silver cash, as Standing Bear had predicted, had been awarded to the Chiricahua under federal treaty law, along with compensation for 30 years of delayed justice. The sound of approaching horses drew Jed's attention to the trail leading. Up from the valley, 3 riders emerged from the morning mist, Marcus Webb, Marshal Harrison, and a third man Jed recognized from newspaper photographs as the new territorial governor appointed by Washington to clean up the mess left by the corruption trials. "Jed," Webb called out as they dismounted, "hope you don't mind the early visit. Governor Matthews wanted to meet you before the ceremony this afternoon." The ceremony? Jed had almost forgotten. Today marked the official dedication of the Samuel Callaway Memorial Library in the territorial capital, funded by his brother's mining fortune and stocked with the evidence that had brought down the conspiracy. More than that, it would house the first comprehensive archive of Apache history and culture, ensuring that the stories suppressed by corrupt officials would finally be preserved and honored. Governor Matthews was a lean man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to difficult decisions. He studied Jed with the frank assessment of a politician who'd learned to distinguish between genuine character and convenient performance. "Mr. Callaway," he said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you personally for what you've accomplished. The evidence your brother gathered has allowed us to clean house in a way that would have been impossible otherwise." "Samuel did the work," Jed replied simply. "I just made sure it saw daylight." Modest to the end, Webb smiled. Tell him about the Washington offer, Governor. Matthews reached into his coat and withdrew an official-looking document bearing the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Department of Justice is creating a new division focused on territorial corruption and Native American affairs. They've asked me to offer you the position of chief investigator with federal authority to pursue cases across territorial boundaries. The offer represented everything Jed had never wanted: responsibility, travel, the kind of public attention that made his skin crawl. But it also represented something Samuel had always valued: the chance to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. I'm honored, Jed said carefully, but I'm not sure I'm the right man for that kind of work. Actually, Marshal Harrison interjected, you're exactly the right man. You've spent 30 years learning to see through deception, to track truth across impossible terrain, to survive in places where corrupt men think they're safe. The government needs someone who can't be bought, intimidated, or fooled by political games. Before Jed could respond, another rider appeared on the trail, Chief Standing Bear, resplendent in ceremonial dress and carrying a leather scroll that emanated official importance. The Apache leader had become something of a celebrity himself, his dignified testimony during the trials earning respect even from former enemies. Brother Calloway, Standing Bear said as he dismounted, using the title that had evolved from their shared struggle in Devil's Canyon. I bring news from the Tribal Council. The scroll contained a formal invitation, written in both English and Apache pictographs, requesting Jed's assistance in establishing a new kind of relationship between native peoples and territorial government. Not the paternalistic oversight of the past, but genuine partnership based on mutual respect and legal equality. The spirit spoke truly in that sacred cave, Standing Bear explained. Justice served brings new possibilities. My people want you to help us build a future where Apache children learn both the old ways and the new, where sacred places are protected by law, and where truth is stronger than politics. Jed looked at the documents in his hands. The federal job offer, the Apache partnership proposal, the newspaper accounts of justice finally served. Each represented a path away from the simple mountain life he'd built, but toward purposes that Samuel would have understood and embraced. From his pocket, he withdrew the compass that had guided them through Devil's Canyon. Its needle pointed steadily north now, no longer spinning with supernatural uncertainty, but providing clear direction for those wise enough to follow it. Samuel always said a man's character is measured by what he does when nobody's watching, Jed said finally. But maybe it's also measured by what he does when everybody is. He looked at Briscoe, whose scarred but alert face suggested the dog was ready for whatever adventures might come, at Webb, whose partnership had proved as valuable as his loyalty, at the officials whose respect had been earned rather than inherited. I'll take the federal position, he decided, but I work my own cases, follow my own leads, and report directly to Washington. No territorial interference, no political pressure. Agreed, Governor Matthews said immediately. And I accept the Apache partnership, Jed continued, looking at Standing Bear. My brother spent 30 years building bridges between our peoples. Time to see if they'll hold the weight of real cooperation. As the sun climbed higher over the Montana mountains, Jed realized that his long exile was finally ending. Not in the solitary peace he'd once craved, but in the kind of purposeful community that his father's letter had described. Family extended beyond blood to include anyone willing to fight for justice and honor. The ceremonial tomahawk hung at his side, a reminder that some promises transcended death and that truth, however long buried, eventually found the light.